You're listening to Motherhood in Between, the show for moms who want to rebuild their bodies, reclaim their energy, and keep pursuing the lives they're called to during the season between babies. I'm your host, Lauran Saunders, registered dietitian, mom of 2 and counting, and founder of Nourished Moms Collective. I help moms recover from their last pregnancy, prepare for their next one, and support their bodies and ambitions in the in-between season of motherhood. Because motherhood shouldn't mean depletion, and your dreams don't disappear when you become a mom. So whether you're rebuilding your health, rediscovering your identity, or growing something meaningful alongside your family, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. If your menstrual cycle came back unpredictable after your last baby, or maybe it hasn't even returned at all, we're going to talk about that in this episode and what you can do to support a more regular menstrual cycle after baby. This is incredibly important if you know that you want to have another child, because that menstrual cycle is a clear sign and indicator of your fertility status. For moms that want to have another baby, either having an absent or an unpredictable cycle can feel like your internal clock isn't very reliable. And many women are told that it's totally normal to not have a menstrual cycle after you have a baby if you're breastfeeding for multiple reasons, etc., etc. But they're not really given an explanation as to why. And there's no acknowledgement that an irregular menstrual cycle is kind of its own category of confusion. Not to mention that I know many women who want to have their babies close together. Many of them are still breastfeeding in between, and they want to have a menstrual cycle come back so that their body can be ready to support another pregnancy. And we're absolutely going to go over a few key things that you can be doing to ensure that your body does have the foundations that it needs to support you and your breastfed baby and potentially a third. And this is actually a core part of what I'm going to teach you today, is that you need to nourish your body as if there are 3 of you, because your body needs to feel safe enough to support you, a breastfeeding baby, and potentially a third baby, aka your reproductive system. And for many women, especially women that I work with in Nourished Moms Collective, when that menstrual cycle finally returns, it's because the body feels safe enough to support a whole nother human, which is what our reproductive cycle is technically for, and it doesn't necessarily depend on a fixed timeline. I've talked before how our body likes to conserve our energy or our resources, and some things are just not top priority if we are very depleted, if we are running on stress hormones and all sorts of things, which we often are as moms who have had a baby if you're breastfeeding. And if you think of your body like a budget, your body's triaging resources like a budget, it's not going to want to open up a new line, aka the return of your menstrual cycle, until we have really covered our bases and we are fully supporting the other areas of priority, which would be breastfeeding, your milk supply, it would be your energy, your sleep, things like that. Now, I want to talk about what is developmentally normal at different stages. So if you are 4 months postpartum, if you're exclusively breastfeeding, you are probably going to have a much higher suppression of your menstrual cycle regulating hormones, and that is normal and expected. Progesterone, which is really important as far as leading up to a menstrual cycle return, that is often impacted with prolactin, which is necessary for milk production. They tend to compete with each other, which is why if you are exclusively breastfeeding, if you have a high output, that is where we could see lower progesterone levels and a more delayed return of a menstrual cycle. Now, that said, I know multiple women who had their menstrual cycle return at 3, 4, 5 months postpartum while they were exclusively breastfeeding, and they continued to exclusively breastfeed. That is just how their body was supported with their hormones. Now, between 6 to 12 months postpartum, it is a lot more common, not necessarily universal, but more common for menstrual cycles to return, especially if your breastfed baby starts to take solids and they start to slowly decrease their milk intake. And then if you are past 12 months with no menstrual cycle, I'm not going to say that's necessarily wrong, but it would be worth taking a closer look, especially because most babies, or now I guess toddlers technically, after 12 months should be eating a lot more solids and drinking less milk. It would be for sure worth looking at what are your body's resources actually going toward, if not supporting reproduction. Now, not everyone's story is that they have no period after baby. Many moms will get a cycle come back that is really short, or it's really long, or it's unpredictable, where maybe it was 23 days this time and then you're at 47 days and you just can't really count on when it's going to come. Or for some, it just feels a little bit off compared to pre-baby, or maybe you're sitting at a 28, 29 day cycle, but you might have a couple days of spotting, or you might have really bad PMS symptoms now, which was never an issue before you had kids. Or maybe you don't notice when you ovulate, or you're not having clear ovulatory signs in your body, or your luteal phase is too short or it's too long. Often an irregular cycle is a very similar, the same root cause as a missing cycle. It's just showing up a little bit differently. And if you are post-baby, it typically stems back to your body being quite depleted and not having the resources to go toward a super regular reproductive cycle. And if you've been told that after babies, it's totally normal to have an irregular menstrual cycle and to just wait it out, that irregularity is not something you just need to live with. It is, in fact, data that your body is trying to give you about what it still needs and where it needs a little bit more support. Now, after my first baby, my period returned, I think I was between 7 and 8 months postpartum. And at that point, my daughter had weaned, I think like one feeding, because she had started to replace that with some solid foods. However, when that cycle came back, I definitely had a shorter luteal phase, and that is often tied to lower progesterone. And like I had mentioned a little bit earlier, progesterone and prolactin compete. So it totally tracks physiologically what my body was going through at that time. Now, I was about 8 months postpartum, and I knew I wanted to get pregnant before my daughter turned 1, which next week's episode, I'm actually going to talk about getting pregnant and pregnancy while breastfeeding. But I was concerned about my shorter luteal phase, my lower progesterone, because it is so important for implantation, conception, and early pregnancy success. And like I said, progesterone and prolactin compete, so that is a normal thing to start to experience. However, there are certainly things that you can do to support your progesterone levels naturally while you are still continuing to breastfeed. And I'm going to come back to that. Now, after my second baby, my period returned at 6 months, and I was still exclusively breastfeeding at that point. I think the key difference here was I was much more intentional with my nourishment right after that second baby got out of me, truly. And when my cycle did return at those 6 months, it was a lot more regular than it had been after baby number 1. It truly was a 28, 29 day cycle with a 12 to 13 day luteal phase, pretty much right from the get-go of when it returned with baby number 2. And that was not what I had experienced with my first baby. I had spent 3 to 4 months trying to get my period back to regular with the first baby after I was having shorter luteal phases and shorter cycles. In fact, with my first baby, I even did some seed cycling. If you are not familiar with that, I might have to do a whole video on that. But doing different types of seeds at different phases in your menstrual cycle to support baseline hormone levels. Now, it does not have a huge impact, especially if you are not having the correct foundations in place with your diet, nutrition, sleep, movement. However, I did find it really helpful, and it's definitely not something that's going to hurt, and seeds are full of amazing nutrients and healthy fats for your fertility in general. So that was something that I did implement, and I do feel like it helped a little bit getting my first menstrual cycle back to regular or after that first baby. Now, if you are breastfeeding and you get a menstrual cycle back, or you want to get your menstrual cycle back, one thing to be aware of is that most women will actually notice a dip in their milk supply correlating with their cycle, often in your luteal phase and moving into menstruation. That was something that I most definitely noticed, and it did seem to be a little bit more prevalent with baby number 2. He also started to self-wean a little bit sooner than my first one did. So I know for a fact I wasn't making quite as much milk at 9, 10, 11 months postpartum with my second baby like I was with my first baby. And so when my period would come around, I most definitely noticed the dip, and I would have to pump a little bit extra to try and compensate for that. And I will say, if you are concerned about this, it truly is just a little hormonal blip. It's not a long-term supply problem, especially when you do have your other foundations in place and you continue to nourish your body. And if you can expect it to happen, I think it's going to save a lot of anxiety. For myself, I would start pumping right after I ovulated, where I would add in 1 extra pumping session a day, just so I could plan and prepare for that luteal and menstrual phase dip. And then right after my period was gone, the milk supply was right back up to normal. I want to go over a few action steps that you can do if you are waiting for a period to return, or if you're trying to get it more regular and more consistent after your last baby. So whether your period is missing or irregular, I don't want you to panic if you are less than 12 months postpartum, but I don't want you to ignore it either, especially if your baby has started weaning, or if you're not breastfeeding as much, or if you know that you want to have another pregnancy sooner rather than later. You definitely want to already be putting in some of this foundational work that's going to help support that return or that regularity of your menstrual cycle. Now, one of the number one things is to prioritize your protein and calorie intake. Whether you're breastfeeding or not, we have a lot of recovery that needs to take place, and we need to be eating enough. And when it comes to protein, it's usually more than you think that you need to be eating. But bare minimum, 100 grams of protein per day is a great place to start. You also need to be really intentional with your healthy fat intake. Our hormones thrive on the fats that we give it, particularly those healthier fats, omega-3s, unsaturated fatty acids. And I know many women who will try to cut back on their fats, especially if we are in the mindset of trying to get our body back and bouncing back after our last baby. But a lot of that can be part of why your menstrual cycle hasn't returned or isn't very regular yet. So aiming to incorporate avocados, olive oil, nuts and seeds, even some cheese, fatty fish like salmon or sardines, and full-fat dairy into your diet is going to be really helpful for our hormone signaling. Another thing that you can be doing right now is being on top of your blood sugar stability and just ensuring that you're not eating carbs by themselves, but always having a protein and a fat or a good amount of fiber in that carb source to help slow down the absorption of the sugar into your blood, so you're not having major spikes or crashes of your blood sugar. This too is so important for our hormone signaling and for our body feeling safe enough, because when we're having these blood sugar spikes and crashes and dips all throughout the day, that is putting additional stress on our body, stress on our nervous system, and that's often stress that we don't necessarily interpret as stress on our body. We don't see it as that because we don't quite feel it as we're going through major life stressors. It's not the same type of thing, but that still can have a huge impact on your health and your body's ability to feel safe. So blood sugar stability should not be overlooked. And of course, I want you to pay attention to your mineral status and make sure that you are having some mineralized drink, a good amount of minerals in your diet throughout the day, hydrating at the cellular level, getting those minerals in because pregnancy was so depleting and breastfeeding itself was so depleting. And if you do have your cycle back, it can be really helpful to track the ebbs and flows and the changes that you're experiencing. Can you pinpoint when you're ovulating? Are you having fertile signs? Is your luteal phase longer than it should be? Is it shorter than it should be? If you are breastfeeding and your cycle returns, are you noticing a dip in your milk supply? All of this is information, and it's not something I want you to be afraid of or anxious of, but knowing what is actually going on in your body is going to be so helpful when it comes to treating it. And then I think it's good to know when it's worth investing with further testing. In Nourished Moms Collective, with the functional testing that we do, looking at minerals or the gut or the functional hormone tests and their metabolites, that can give us a lot of really clear answers on why your menstrual cycle might be really wonky or might not even be there at all. And knowing when it's worth investigating might look different person to person. If you know that you want to have a baby, again, as soon as possible, and your menstrual cycle is not a reliable indicator on when to even try to get pregnant, I would probably start investigating as soon as possible so that you can meet the timeline that you have. In fact, I had a client, she was 11 months postpartum, still breastfeeding, no menstrual cycle, and she really wanted to get pregnant again. With her first baby, she had to go through IUI, and so she needed her cycle to return before they could even go and start the fertility process again. And like I said, at 11 months, it's not necessarily ultra concerning if your cycle hasn't returned, but in her case of her really wanting to have another baby sooner rather than later, it was a concern for her. So we really worked on rebuilding her foundation and making sure her body had the resources it needed to feel safe enough for that return of her cycle. And it did return within 2 months once that nourishment was prioritized. And then she actually ended up getting pregnant naturally on the cycle after that. Now, another client of mine, she was 18 months postpartum and she still didn't have a cycle return at that point. That one is a little bit more atypical and there tends to be a lot more going on under the surface because by 18 months, typically, even if you are still breastfeeding, your toddler is eating most of their calories from food. Now, for her, we did a full deep dive in her nutrient status, so what her body truly needed so that it could feel safe enough to replenish and prioritize reproduction. And again, within 2 months, she got her period back. She was still breastfeeding during this time, and then she actually did get pregnant on the next cycle. These are two different moms. One started at 11 months, one started at 18 months. The commonality is that it doesn't necessarily matter how far postpartum you are beyond about 6 to 8 months. But how you are nourishing your body is how safe your body is going to feel to start to prioritize reproduction again. If you are still breastfeeding, I don't want you to think that having no period or an irregular period means that there is nothing you can do but wait just because you are breastfeeding. There absolutely are things that you can do to still support the return of your menstrual cycle and support your milk supply and lactation. And if you are dealing with an irregular period, as is since having your last baby, there is most definitely a difference between normal and optimal. And you are not powerless and you are not stuck with having an irregular menstrual cycle just because you've given birth in the past. If you are interested in learning more about the testing that we do inside of Nourished Moms Collective to help with menstrual cycle regularity and return, you can get more details at nourishedmomscollective.com. And our new Nourished Moms Collective membership is now open for enrollment for resources, education, and support. If you're more of a do-it-yourself type of mom, you can find those details below as well. In the next episode, we are going to dive into breastfeeding while trying to conceive and getting pregnant, breastfeeding while pregnant, and all of the joys and the fun and maybe the not so fun things that can come along with that.